is more radioactive than you think. So when you got the
Ah,
tobacco leaves growing, they're actually grabbing the radon gas that I was just talking about, and the
mhm.
radon gets stuck to the tobacco, and then it decays into other stuff. And when people smoke, they're actually inhaling radioactive particles inside of them. So it's not just that the tobacco is radioactive, the tobacco is depositing stuff inside of your lungs that makes your lungs, the inside of your lungs, radioactive, so that you're
Ha.
constantly getting irradiated because you've smoked.
Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. I'm delighted to welcome back today on Podcast for Inquiry Professor Jason Donev. Jason is tenured at the University of Calgary and leads the world's largest and most used energy resource for adults, EnergyEducation.ca. Jason works to help people understand nuclear power's role in providing reliable energy without emitting greenhouse gases. In today's conversation, Jason and I talk about many aspects of nuclear power that we didn't cover in our first conversation together, including how harmful is radiation? Is nuclear power truly low carbon? And what about its cost? And how sustainable is nuclear energy? And can we build nuclear plants to replace more carbon emitting forms of power generation? Or do we just increase our consumption when more capacity comes online? It's a fantastic conversation, and I am very pleased to bring you my second conversation with Professor Jason Donev. Jason Donev, welcome back to Podcast for Inquiry.
Good to be back.
I want to continue the conversation that we started a couple of weeks ago on nuclear energy. For those who are just tuning into this episode, we had an extensive conversation about how electricity is only one small part of our energy budget, and nuclear has a place in the electricity budget, but there's a lot more to energy than just that. I do want to focus on nuclear power and nuclear plants and some of the concerns that people have and some of their advantages and disadvantages. And one of the things that we didn't really talk to last time that is kind of foremost on people's minds is radiation, and just how dangerous or not dangerous it would be. And I want to start by asking, how dangerous is radiation? Like if any amount causes cancer, you would expect cities that have a high elevation like Denver to have a higher background rate than those that are lower, because the solar radiation is higher, is greater the higher the altitude. But that's not what we see. And we get things like X-rays, which is like radiation, and we consider that to be at least reasonably safe, for the benefits that we get are better. And people fly without really being worried about the radiation exposure. But when we talk about nuclear energy, suddenly radiation becomes something where like zero exposure is too much.
Yeah.
So you can bring it into the context of nuclear energy, but I'd like to start by asking, how harmful is radiation? Obviously, too much is fatal. I mean, the same thing can be said of heat, right? You cook yourself, you die. But at what point is radiation, a tiny little bit is harmless, and does it just become harmful and then it becomes fatal? Please talk to me about radiation and its effects on the human body and human wellness.
Absolutely. So, if you'll forgive the pedagogical nature of how I talk about these things, because as a teacher, I wind up just totally going pedagogue on people. So, I'm going to start by going backwards a little bit and saying, if you remember from your high school geometry class, you had line segments which start at one point and end at one point. And then you have lines which go off infinitely in both directions.
Right.
And then a ray is sort of halfway between the two, where it starts at one point and then it travels infinitely far in one direction.
Yeah.
Okay.
I remember.
Yeah. Good. Good. Yeah. No. Generally, if I frame it that way, people are like, oh yeah, I remember that. Okay. So when we're talking about rays, they start at one point and they go out, and it's etymologically related to the word radii, radius, right, for a circle, right, starting in
Yep.
the center and going out. So when we're talking about radiation, what we're talking about is energy that is traveling in a ray.
It has an origin point and it just keeps going until something stops it.
Yep, exactly. So it keeps going until something stops it. So when we have radiation is one of the ways that energy can be transferred. Um, So heat, for example, if you have something incandescently hot, incandescence means that it is hot enough that it is giving off radiation. So our sun, for example, is incandescent. Well, an incandescent light bulb is obviously also incandescent. It is giving off radiation. When we have energy coming from an incandescent light bulb, that is in fact radiation. And you could do a cool little experiment where if you have an incandescent light bulb, you can feel the heat coming off of it. And you
Right.
could just take a piece of paper and pass it in between you and the light bulb, and you'll feel that heat suddenly stop. Likewise, if you're at a campfire and somebody walks between you and the campfire, um, the heat will just suddenly turn off. Right? It goes away very rapidly. And if somebody keeps walking, the heat comes back because some significant portion of the heat that you're getting from a campfire is coming off as radiation. So this gives us some idea that radiation behaves much like light. And as physicists were looking at radiation, we realized that light is actually a form of radiation. Visible light is something that is starting at a point, traveling in a straight line until it hits something that stops it. Visible light has more energy per little packet, per photon, than heat does. Okay, so when you have heat, you're generally getting lots and lots and lots of photons with very little energy. When you're getting visible light, you're getting fewer photons with less energy, with more energy. And then you can keep going more and more so that the individual packets of light, the individual photons, the individual quantum bits of light called photons are carrying more and more energy. And what Einstein got his Nobel Prize for was not the theory of relativity, which is what everybody assumes. What Einstein got his Nobel Prize for was the photoelectric effect, which said if you have enough energy in a photon, it will have the ability to move an electron from one place to another. And if you don't have, so if you need 5 units to move from one place to another, your photon has 5 units, it goes in, it hits it, it goes up. The electron goes up, it goes through this transition. If you have 2 photons, 2.5, or 5 photons, each with 1, it won't be able to make that transition. It's like trying to go up a stair. You have to lift your foot high enough to get up to the next level.
Right. Okay. So you can't do it piecemeal. It has to be all in one.
All in one go. All in
Right.
one go.
Okay.
So when we have photons that have enough energy, the photons that have enough energy are enough to take the electrons around an atom, rip it off entirely, and you no longer have an atom, you now have an ion.
Right. So now you take off an electron. So electrons are negatively charged. It's escaped. So you've got a positive. You still have the nucleus intact where the protons are. So now the atom overall is positively charged.
Right. So you're left with we call a cation. Wow, because it's positive there. Now you'll never forget, and you'll never forgive me for that terrible bit. So we have the positively charged atom left over that was hit with this radiation. But keep in mind that in order to do that, Einstein's theory that led to the photoelectric effect, that led to his Nobel Prize, Einstein's theory says what we have to have is a sufficiently energetic single photon. So it's not the number of photons that does it, it's how energetic that individual photon is. Because we now have radiation that is making an ion, in the terrible inability for physicists to come up with good names for things, we call it ionizing radiation. It's terrible the way we name things in physics. There's no creativity. There's no poetry in that.
Right.
So we have
I remember in Calvin and Hobbes, instead of the Big Bang, it should be the terrible space kablooey. Yeah.
exactly, right?
We should get
Um,
cartoonists to name things, but we're
we
stuck
should
with
let's
scientific
call Bill
nomenclature.
Watterson right now and say we have a name convention emergency. Come out of retirement, please rename ionizing radiation. So linguistically again, what happens is when you have a phrase like ionizing radiation and people aren't using the word radiation for anything else, ionizing radiation gets shortened down to just radiation. So I had to go through all of this explanation to be very, very clear. We are exposed to radiation all the time of all sorts. It's the ionizing radiation that does cause a certain amount of problems.
Okay.
So,
Well,
as I said,
in a sense, we could. So, is there a different name for the type of radiation that is not ionizing, that isn't energetic enough to kick the electron to the next level?
yeah, it's called non-ionizing radiation.
So the creativity at least is consistent. All
The
right. So,
creativity is consistent. Please, Bill Watterson, we need you.
all right. So is there is there an amount of non-ionizing radiation that becomes harmful, or can you be exposed to essentially an arbitrary amount, like a huge amount of non-ionizing radiation, and it's still safe? It doesn't have any harmful effects on humans.
Huge amount, yes. Infinite amount, no. So
Okay.
if you get a sunburn, for example, that
Yes.
is coming. So there's this sort of gray zone of ultraviolet light that's kind of ionizing, kind of not ionizing. Like it's right
It's
on the edge.
okay.
So UV is kind of ionizing, kind of not ionizing. I'm trying to sweep a lot of technical details under the rug here. But you can also imagine where if you go down into heat, microwaves, for example, if you have a microwave photon that has even less energy than, say, visible light,
Mhm.
but you wouldn't want to stick yourself in a microwave. That would be deadly. That would be very dangerous. Do not try that at home. Um,
Yeah, and probably wouldn't fit. So
well,
I guess you could build a big one.
it's the internet. Like I don't want to. I don't want to get into too much detail, but
Okay. So you can take so, but there's a difference between ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. In reasonable quantities, non-ionizing radiation is safe and not harmful. If you have ludicrous amounts, of course, ludicrous amounts of anything is bad, including
yeah.
non-ionizing radiation. Okay.
So with ionizing radiation, for the same amount of energy, I want to be clear: ionizing radiation is more dangerous. It is more harmful. It's also harder to get. Right? So the more energy packed into a single photon, the more difficult it is to get that photon.
Right.
So we can do things, we can do tricks. So you mentioned when we're in a low lying area like you are in the Greater Toronto area, you don't get as much cosmic radiation from space. Not so much solar. It's actually other things in space are raining down particles and so forth. So the higher elevation you're at, the more ionizing radiation comes from space. So I'm here in Calgary, and the more I'm getting more ionizing radiation at the moment from space than you are just because of elevation. And if you take a flight, you get even more ionizing radiation from the cosmic rays.
Right.
Okay, so that's one place we can get radiation. We also get radiation from the homes we live in. So, for example, I am currently, as you might be able to tell from the windows behind me, I am currently in a basement, which means I'm going to have a certain amount of radon exposure. So radon is a noble gas. So chemically, it's on the right-hand side of the periodic table. It's got a full electron orbital. So that makes it chemically very non-reactive. It's not chemically toxic at all. But radon gas gives off alpha rays, which we'll come back to, but is a very, when it's inside of you, it's a very harmful form of radiation. So I'm currently in the basement and I'm getting some radon exposure from that. So these are naturally occurring sources of radiation. Potassium 40, which occurs just in bananas, has a certain amount of radiation. If you want to have a little fun, a friend of mine, Ulf Stammer from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, wrote up an entire thing on the banana equivalent dose and the flight time equivalent dose. Like there's all these fun things that you can find. XKCD did a great cartoon on this a few years ago. just quantifying the radiation. We can put those links in the comments. Um, so there's these natural sources of radiation, but those natural sources of radiation tend to be rare and almost never come in a quantity that allows us to be harmed. So our bodies, other living organisms have. I mean, I'm on the Center for Inquiry podcast. I'm sure it's okay for me to use the word evolve without fear of repercussions. So life has evolved in a radiation field, an ionizing radiation field. So not just the infrared and microwaves and so forth. Life has evolved. Earth has always had ionizing radiation, and living organisms have the ability to repair some damage from ionizing radiation. When we have technology that is sitting down and deliberately making really, really energetic processes happen at the microscopic level, we can make a lot of ionizing radiation, and that's where we need to really start being careful. And that's what's different from what's happening with nature. You can get a lot more concentrated radiation out of a deliberate process that you do with technology than you're ever going to get with nature.
So when it comes to nuclear reactors and the waste products that come out of them, how much of that radiation is ionizing and how much is non-ionizing?
I don't have a good answer for that question. It's a good question. It's a reasonable question. I think the way I would frame it, though, is slightly different. Not because your question was bad, but because I can answer this question better than I can answer your question. If I fail to answer your underlying concern, let me know and we'll try again.
All right.
The amount of radiation coming off is something that can be quantified. So if you have a CANDU reactor fuel bundle, which I believe we showed in the first episode, and I don't have here with me today, but it's roughly the size of a rolled up yoga mat.
Mm-hmm. I remember seeing that.
Yeah. So you take that out of the reactor, and it is both hot in the sense of being kitchen stove hot. Like if you touched it, you would burn. It would feel hot like a log coming out of a fireplace that's
Right.
on
Well,
fire.
its whole purpose is to boil water to create steam to turn a turbine to create electricity. So that it's hot in a temperature sense makes that's its whole purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it is also hot from a ionizing radiation standpoint. So from the standpoint of stuff is coming off of that is going to wind up causing those ions. Keep in mind that when you cause ions in a living thing, you are suddenly messing with the chemistry that's supposed to keep us alive. So I have been accused when I've done these talks before of not taking ionizing radiation seriously enough. And I want to be clear. I do think it is a very serious thing. I do think that it's a very it's a hazard that needs to be managed properly. We cannot and should not take this too lightly. So when we have the spent fuel bundle coming out, there is sufficient radiation coming off of that, sufficient ionizing radiation to do fatal level damage to living things, including humans. People can die from being next to one of those fuel bundles. So we make sure nobody's ever next to one of those fuel bundles.
That makes sense.
So there's a real element of, yeah, it is dangerous. And I can't remember if I used this before or not. Did I talk about the lion versus the zebra?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so you walk into a zoo and you see a lion. And the lions are put in cages for lions. And the zookeepers working with lions know that they are working with a creature, an animal that can kill them with no remorse, with no warning. It's not just some big fuzzy cat. I mean, sure, it's kind of fun when they hang out in the boxes, just like a house cat does.
Mm-hmm.
But a lion is not an animal anybody wants to get into the cage with. Like that is very, very dangerous. So they build cages for lions accordingly. Zebras, on the other hand, look like a striped horse. So nobody looks at zebras and goes, "Oh man, that is a really deadly thing." Nobody looks at zebras and goes, "That could kill me." Well, some people who actually know zebras do. So more people are attacked and even killed by zebras than by lions in zoos, right? Like, just, it's how you engineer the whole thing and how the human mind works in approaching the whole thing. So when we have the deadly dangerous amount of radiation coming off of a spent nuclear fuel bundle, and let's be clear, it could kill us. We know that, though. So we create a situation in which it would be very, very, very difficult for anybody to even do that on purpose, let alone by accident. You don't inadvertently get lost in the zoo and wind up in the lion cage. I mean, hopefully you don't get lost in the zoo and wind up in the zebra pen either. But you could imagine, a 3-year-old getting away from a parent is more likely to wind up in the pen with the zebra, and it would be almost impossible for the 3-year-old to wind up in the pen with the lion. And that's the way we build the nuclear reactor.
And that's why the storage it's engineered to minimize the chances to as close to zero as possible that that spent fuel rods the radiation emanating from them will actually harm a human being.
Correct. Which is why in 60 years in Canada, we've never had anybody get injured by spent nuclear fuel.
And what about when it's actually operating? Like when it's in full in full, I was going to say bloom, that's not the right term, but when we're splitting the atoms into fuel rods and we are creating enormous amounts of heat and forms of radiation to boil the water, how much radiation escapes the actual water tank where it's boiling the water, because that's when it's at its maximum.
Right. So there's a few ways to answer that question. One, nuclear experts go and stand next to it all day long, every day. So people who study nuclear and the effects of radiation go and hang out there on purpose.
And do they actually have any higher rates of cancer or radiation-induced illnesses than the general population? I mean, maybe they're just foolhardy, right? People jump out of planes. And maybe nuclear experts are by nature reckless, or perhaps not. But I think it's a question that needs to be answered. Like, do they get cancer more than other people? Do they get radiation poisoning more than?
So radiation poisoning is something that happens with a very acute dose on a short timeline.
Okay.
Which did happen with the Chernobyl workers, right? Like after Chernobyl, you had people get acute radiation. And one of the interesting things that we don't often talk about is that acute radiation sickness is in fact something that can be treated in a hospital. Like, we have medical procedures to help with acute radiation sickness. So if somebody gets a really, really major dose of radiation, there's a certain level at which they're going to die and there's nothing we can do. But below that, there are actual medical treatments.
Right. You're going to die without treatment, but if you're in a hospital, you can be treated and you can make a full recovery.
Yes. And I'm, as I'm fond of saying, I'm not that kind of doctor. I can't discuss any
That's
details.
fine. We don't need those details. Just that you can, but just that there's that type of treatment. So, but I think what I'm actually asking about is the lower dose, like do people that work at nuclear reactors, that study nuclear reactions and test reactors or commercial ones, employees at nuclear plants, are they
cancer more often?
Do they get cancer more often, or any other radiation-induced illness?
Yeah. So, broadly speaking, the radiation concerns you've got are the really acute dose that we just talked about, which, like I said, happened with Chernobyl workers, happened with nuclear bomb survivors with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They survive the initial blast. They live for a little while and they die. Then you've got cancer. So cancer, there's an exposure, and then over time, because there's what's called the latency period, where you have an exposure, and then after a period of time, the cancer develops. And one of the things that's tricky and scary about radiation is there's this invisible ray that is doing damage to my body that I can't feel, that will wind up potentially causing harm years later.
Right. So it's really, it's difficult to say if you get sick in 10 years, was it because you toured a nuclear power plant, or was it going to happen anyway from just randomly. It's very hard to disentangle those.
It is. It is. Although um, this is not really my this is not my direct field, but I certainly have looked into this. You can get into studies where certain types of cancer seem to be caused by certain types of stimulus. So I
Okay.
to tip my hand for the end because I don't want to seem like I'm avoiding your question. The answer is nuclear power workers actually live longer than the general populace.
Okay. So it's
So
vitamin R.
yes, I'm gonna build up to that, but I want to just be clear. I'm not trying to avoid the question because the answer is better than you think, but there's a lot of nuance that I want to talk about
All right.
before we fully
Well, I
get
want
there.
to move on to other areas. So get on to that, but or sorry, you can build on that, but then I want to move on to some other questions that I have.
Sure. So when we're talking about radiation exposure and the risk of cancer, the first thing I want to make clear is radiation actually only causes a very small fraction of cancers.
Okay.
Cancers are there's a lot of other carcinogens. Chemical carcinogens are absolutely a thing, right?
Yeah.
Like if you smoke cigarettes, that causes
Yeah.
cancer.
Yeah, and that's not because of the radiation and the tobacco. It's because of
Although
all the other things.
oddly, tobacco is radioactive.
Okay. Well, isn't everything to some extent, right? Like,
Tobacco is more radioactive than you think. So when you got the
okay.
tobacco leaves growing, they're actually grabbing the radon gas that I was just talking about, and the
Hmm.
radon gets stuck to the tobacco, and then it decays into other stuff. And when people smoke, they're actually inhaling radioactive particles inside of them. So it's not just that the tobacco is radioactive, the tobacco is depositing stuff inside of your lungs that makes your lungs, the inside of your lungs, radioactive, so that you're
Huh.
constantly getting irradiated because you've smoked.
Okay, so smoking, don't do it.
Don't do it. But the really funny thing is that despite how much radiation you're getting from the tobacco and the residual built up in your lungs, it's actually the chemicals in tobacco that are more harmful than the radiation
Right.
from tobacco. So I want to be clear about that there has become in the public consciousness this link between radiation and cancer, and there is a link, but there's a lot of other things that cause cancer as well.
Right.
So
Well, cancer is a catch-all term for hundreds of different things that go wrong. And some of them are caused by radiation, and many more are caused by chemical toxins of various
well, and,
sorts.
and some of it's actually just caused by old age.
Right. The body breaks down.
Yeah, the body starts breaking down. There's again, I'm not a biologist, and I shouldn't be
Right.
trying to explain this, but there's a lot to cancer, and I can get you guests if you want to just talk about biological effects of radiation who know way more about
Okay.
it than I do.
Well, I think we've covered that to a
Sure.
sufficient degree. I'd like if
Just
I'd like
one
to.
final thought on this,
Sure,
because I did say that nuclear power workers live longer than the general populace.
you
Some
did.
part of that is that nuclear power workers are paid well.
Hmm.
Um, point one. Point two, nuclear power workers actually tend to have a very stable job that has vacation time. It has enough time in the day and in the week for people to cook for themselves. They have enough money that they can get lots of fresh fruits and vegetables. It's not that living next to a nuclear power plant or working for a nuclear power plant is making people um, biologically superior. It's that all these things that we know from other studies, proper nutrition, time
Right.
off, sense of purpose, sense of place, stability.
Education, sufficient wealth,
Yeah,
stability, low existential stress, all of which contribute to longevity. Almost
right.
independent of what the profession is. Nuclear engineer is one of them that has those
Oh, it's
qualities.
not just nuclear engineers. The janitors who work at nuclear power plants are the best
Mhm.
paid janitors in North America, which I'm
Ah,
fine with. Like I
yeah,
want my janitors in a nuclear power plant to know, don't go
sure,
in there, don't unplug this. Like those are
yeah,
highly trained custodians of waste and so forth. Even people who don't work in the plant themselves, if they work in like accounting or human resources or something, they actually also live longer. It's not just the engineers. The people in the nuclear workforce are well taken care of financially by the companies that they work for, and we see positive health effects. So it's not just radiation, but we do not see any increased danger of cancer and so forth because the amount of exposure from living near a nuclear power plant or working at a nuclear power plant is an insignificant bump up from what is already occurring naturally. So
Right.
living next to a
And you
nuclear
get more radiation as like in Mexico City or Denver than you would by working in a nuclear
power.
plant that's at a lower elevation.
Right. So there's the amount that we naturally get exposed to, and the nuclear power does this.
Just a
Just a
tiny amount.
little tiny bump. And that's why
Okay.
we're confident that people living next to nuclear power plants aren't getting an increased risk of cancer.
All right.
There, that's my complete answer. We can talk about something else now.
Yeah, great. Okay, so one of the strongest arguments in favor of nuclear energy, and it's hammered home again and again, is that it's a carbon-free technology or that it's low carbon. And
Very low carbon.
I want to challenge that, not from a expertise perspective, but from an outsider's perspective looking at it. Let me tell you why. I want to be convinced that that's true. I think once it's built and you're operating it, and like from the time you turn it on and you're generating the power, okay, fine. Like that's you're not generating significant amounts of carbon in that process, but it's a huge building, lots of concrete, which has to be mined and refined, and that's a very carbon intensive process. You've got the many kilometers of piping, which needs to be mined and refined, and again a fairly carbon intensive process. And also the mining of the uranium. Now, I know that you don't need a lot of uranium, like the amount of uranium that you need compared to the amount of natural gas or oil or coal for the equivalent amount of energy is very small. But uranium is a rare earth. In order to get your however many grams of uranium you need to mine a lot of earth, a lot of rock, and then you have to purify it from all of the rock that's there to get those few grams. And that too is an energy intensive process. And most of all of that energy is coming from fossil fuels. So I'm trying to understand on a sort of order of magnitude basis, all of those inputs require a great deal of energy. How accurate is the carbon neutral or low carbon energy source given the high carbon or the high energy intensity that is required to get us to the point where the nuclear reactor is up and running, and then for the uranium to keep it going for the decades that it will be running.
And the spent fuel disposal, like that should be
Yes,
thrown out.
yes, so absolutely. If we're digging, yeah, we're burying it 3 kilometers deep in the Canadian Shield. That's a huge excavation project that, again, it probably runs on a lot of gasoline.
Diesel, actually, but yeah.
Okay, fine. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, same in terms of carbon emissions, but okay. So, this is a good point, and this is why I actually qualify it as why I like that you qualified it as low carbon rather than carbon free. So, we're gonna you brought up a lot of points. This is the entire nuclear fuel cycle, and I'm going to try and do this succinctly, and we'll fail.
You're a fascinating man, Jason, but succinct is not a way that I would describe you.
Fair. Okay, so the way we deal with this kind of calculation is we do what's called a life cycle analysis or a life cycle assessment.
Okay.
And one of the things that, whether we're talking about the risks of nuclear or we're talking about the carbon emissions of nuclear, it's important to have a complete picture and to compare the complete picture of nuclear to the complete picture of, say, solar, or the complete picture of wind, or the complete picture of hydro, or the complete picture of coal. As I believe I mentioned in the first episode, I'm leaving oil aside because oil is almost exclusively used for transportation rather than electricity. There are exceptions, but for the most part, oil products are over there doing transportation. That's a different issue.
Okay.
But talking about natural gas or coal or wind or solar or hydro or nuclear, we have to come up with a way of making an overall comparison. So I'm going to make the statement that nuclear, just again to tip my hand for the end, nuclear nuclear is fairly comparable to solar, for wind, and for hydro,
Okay.
geothermal.
In
They're
terms of
all,
carbon emissions.
in terms of carbon emissions, when you look at everything you just described,
Hmm.
nuclear is comparable. Life
Okay.
cycle assessment is difficult. Life cycle assessment is nuanced. Life cycle assessment is a there's certainly a science to it, but there's also an art, and there's a lot of, I would say, even ethical choices about where do you put the limits. Um, and again, if you'd like an expert on life cycle analysis, I
Hmm.
know them. I'm not one, but I can put you in touch, and you can uh, pepper them with questions. So you can make this. So if you have coal is like a kilogram of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Natural gas is like 700 grams. And then all of these other things are in the few grams per kilowatt hour. So a kilowatt
So we
hour,
go from 100 to 70 to less than 10.
no, 1,700 to
Oh, I'm
1.
sorry. 1,700 and then down to single digits or
2 digits.
two digits. Okay. But that's still a huge
It's a
improvement.
huge difference. So order of magnitude in terms of carbon emissions, just from a carbon perspective,
Yeah.
a
Yep. That's what
nuclear
we're
versus
talking about right
hydro
now.
versus solar versus wind is lost in the noise. And what do you include? What do you not include? Um, and then even what type of nuclear reactor are you using?
Yeah. There's
Like
different types, of course. Yeah.
all of these things factor in. Um, so that's the broad answer. Um, and yes, people have done this study. Different people have done this study. Different people have done the study and come to the same conclusions. Canadian nuclear reactors actually fare better than American nuclear reactors on this, but it's in the noise. It's not a
Okay.
fundamental difference. It is
But
true though, and
mhm.
it is true that building a nuclear reactor emits more carbon dioxide because making concrete, it's not even so much the mining of the material, but actually the process we use to make the cement for concrete
Mhm.
emits a lot of CO2. So in terms of CO2 emission, coal is the number one, oil is number two, natural gas is number three, making concrete, making the cement for concrete is number four. So it's behind our three fossil fuels, but it is the fourth biggest contribution to greenhouse gases that humans do.
Okay.
So making a nuclear power plant does, in fact, because there is more concrete, the piping, is, as you said, making a nuclear power plant does, in fact, emit more CO2 than making a coal fired power plant. But because a nuclear power plant, once it's made, lasts for decades, as does a coal plant for that matter, you
Right.
have a lot of energy coming out to levelize the amount of CO2 down to those same low numbers that you're getting for wind and for solar.
Right. But yeah, the difference is that with coal, it's constantly emitting a huge amount of carbon dioxide throughout the whole life cycle, and with nuclear,
And a lot of other crap.
all of it is up front. Not all of it, but most of it is up front, and then a very very small amount once it starts generating electricity throughout
Yeah,
for the
vast
30,
majority.
40, 50
Vast majority.
years that it's running. Okay.
Yeah. And I want to be clear with coal fired power plants, it's not just the CO2. You're emitting mercury, NOx, sulfur,
Yeah.
particulate matter.
Yeah.
There's
Coal, all kinds of pollutants. The asthma rates around a coal plant and the number of deaths from asthma and lung diseases is much much higher.
Yeah, so like
It's
switching from coal to natural gas, which Alberta did recently, did a
mhm.
lot to reduce the risk of acid rain, the mercury contamination. Like
Yeah.
there's
Ontario did something similar several years ago.
yeah, but what Ontario did was different from what Alberta did. What Alberta did was
Okay.
switch from coal to natural gas. What Ontario did was switch from coal to nuclear. Now there was some natural gas and some hydro that got brought in as well, but spinning up nuclear was a lot of how Ontario was able to actually get off the coal train, if you'll excuse the expression. And the nuclear industry was really ticked that the public can take a very out of sight, out of mind. Where does my electricity come from? It comes from a hole in the wall. I pay my hydro bill. So we
Remember
don't,
that it's called Ontario Hydro, right? That's
well,
that's
not
the name
anymore.
of our.
It's called Ontario Power Generation, but it was called Ontario Hydro for a long time.
Okay. Is it Toronto Hydro? I'm trying to remember now. Anyway, yeah, maybe I'm just too old and I've forgotten how when the companies renamed themselves. Okay, that is very helpful. Thank you. Um, uh, an argument that some people make, and I'd like you to put it into some context, is it's all very well and good about carbon, but um, it's just so expensive, and we can and should use other forms of energy. I read this is a fairly timely. Just a couple of weeks ago, Ontario has announced that it's going to build what's called a small modular reactor (SMR).
Mhm.
First time in decades that a new plant is going to be built in Canada. New nuclear plant will be built in Canada.
Mhm.
And I've read about SMRs, and it's in the name, small modular reactors. So they are smaller, they're portable, or more, or in pieces. Not portable, but they're supposed to be less expensive. And if I recall the article that I read correctly, it's they're going to build 3 SMR reactors at a cost of over $20 billion, so like $7 or so billion each. That doesn't strike me as inexpensive. And so, what's the cost of creating electricity from a nuclear source compared to coal, gas, solar, wind? Is it much higher? Is it lower? There's a claim that it's expensive, and anytime we talk about nuclear energy, it's always in the billions or tens of billions of dollars. So the argument that it's just way too expensive on the surface seems plausible, and I'd like you to address that.
Um, this is a difficult question, and I think that there is a legitimate, grounded concern about how expensive nuclear is. I don't think the argument is crazy. I, I I'm a nuclear advocate, but I do my best to be honest, and I do believe that the upfront cost of nuclear is one of the difficulties that makes nuclear difficult to deploy. The other related idea that is part of what factors into the cost is the lead time to build a nuclear reactor is huge
Yeah,
compared to.
well, I mean, as I said, this is the first time in decades that a
Yep,
nuclear facility is being built in this country.
sure. So, um, so when it comes to, we'll just pick on coal for a moment. When it comes to building a coal-fired power plant, there's a reason that for a couple years China was putting an Alberta, like if you know how much Alberta's grid is, they were putting that much coal, new coal-fired generation, new coal plants. They did this for years throughout the 20 teens. Um, they put that much new coal-fired power plants on the China grid every month.
Every month. I thought
Yeah.
you were going to say every year. Okay, wow. Every month. Okay.
So when we're talking about building cheaply, building quickly, coal can be done quickly and cheaply. But you get into this idea of what's called internal versus external costs, right? So what are you paying in healthcare for what you're saving on your electricity bill?
Right.
So what does cheap actually mean? And who is paying what?
Yeah. So this is the concept of externalities.
Yes, exactly. So when you're just looking at, I'm going to put up a power plant and I want to burn it, I want to make electricity, and I want to sell that electricity, it's actually really, really hard to beat coal. And it's really hard to beat coal because you're just burning something that doesn't require high technology.
Right.
Okay. Natural gas, very similar to coal, not nearly as deadly, not nearly as polluting, but you can build those really quickly as well. You can make them more efficient than you can make a coal fired power plant for reasons we can get into if you care. Um, but it's the same sort of thing. Natural gas is actually fairly cheap. Now, one of the interesting things about natural gas specifically, so now I'm going to pick on natural gas, is that building a natural gas plant is a relatively small cost. It's fairly cheap to build a natural gas plant, but it's really expensive to run a natural gas plant. And the price of natural gas fluctuates pretty wildly.
Right.
Okay. So in terms of we're going to just put down some money and then go, but we'll pay later, natural gas is the way to go. Nuclear, well, let's actually focus on wind and solar first. Wind and solar are expensive up front, but as long as you've got them, they're really cheap to run.
Right. It's okay.
Okay.
The maintenance is relatively low, and then it just keeps generating power as long as it's windy or the sun is shining.
And your material doesn't run out, or like solar cells do degrade over time, but on the whole, we see not a lot of degradation. Like they last for decades. Wind
Okay.
turbines, on the other hand, last 10, 15 years, depending on who you believe and which wind turbine you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. But they do wear out over time. But they're very expensive to set up, and they're not reliable, right? They're not something that you can. We have to use electricity within a finger snap of when it's created. Like we don't have a lot of time. We have to match our demand and our generation very, very exactly. So when you're talking about wind and solar, they're very expensive to set up. They're very cheap to use, but they are also cheap from the standpoint of they're not giving you what you want, which is a reliable electricity grid. So they can be
Right.
part of what you've got, but they can't be everything of what you've got. You have to do things like battery backup, and hydro actually pairs really well with wind and solar. So wind and solar are expensive in the immediate, and if you do a life cycle assessment, they don't do so well, which is one of the reasons we built up all this fossil fuel in the first place, because fossil fuels are just cheaper. They're cheaper in the short term, they're cheaper in the long term, as long as you're ignoring those externalities, which we
Right.
shouldn't ignore. I'm not in favor of ignoring those
Right.
externalities.
But we can talk about just the dollars and cents and money
Yeah.
for a moment. But one of the things that that hydro and nuclear have in common, I imagine, is that in order to get that first bit of electricity out, you have to build the entire thing. It's like they're very capital intensive.
Yeah.
Once the
So
dam
much.
is completed, you have to maintain the dam, but that's fairly low, and then you've got all the electricity that the dam can generate. Same thing with a nuclear power plant. You have to build the whole plant. You get that first kilowatt out, and then again you've got your well-paid janitors and nuclear engineers and all the other staff. But compared to the tens of billions to build the plant itself, and compared to the amount of energy that's created, it's a relatively low price. Is that a fair assessment of those two technologies?
To the point where it's been very rare for companies to build either hydro or nuclear. It is almost always the case that it is Crown Corporation or just the government that is building hydroelectric power plants or nuclear power plants. Because the initial capital investment and the time to start getting money back is so long
Right.
that the interest rate on your money has a significant impact on how expensive your nuclear power plant is. So when we say small modular reactor, um, we are not. It's not as small as people think. Like small makes it sound warm and friendly and fuzzy, and that's great. I'm in
I can
favor.
have one in my living room.
Yeah. No. Talking about a small modular reactor, we're still talking about 300 megawatts electric. So
Okay, that's a lot.
yeah, so the BWRX 300, which is the type of reactor that the small modular reactor. This is the small one, right? The
Mhm.
small modular reactor that Ontario is looking at building, and I think we'll be building. Like I don't mean to poo poo the possibility. I think it's coming. Is still 300 megawatts. So it's not nearly as small, but it is smaller. To me, the more important thing is not that it's smaller, but that it's faster. You can build them faster than you can build the traditional nuclear power plants because you can have a lot of the parts being built in a factory and shipped in, as opposed to everything being done on site.
Okay, that's where the modular comes in.
And that's where the modular comes in. So it's the old gag, and I don't even know if Henry Ford ever said this, but you can have the Model T in any color you want as long as it's black.
It's widely attributed to him. I don't know whether he actually said
I
it.
should look that up at some point. But what the genius of Ford, and there were a lot. Ford's a very problematic person, but the genius of Ford was that he actually took the idea of craftsmanship and just threw it out the window and said, "All right, we're going to train person to make this one part of the car, and that's going to be their job all day long." So this assembly line manufacturing, he I don't know about perfected it, but he certainly advanced it in really considerable ways. SMRs do the same thing. So when we're talking about time to construction, if you have to take $1 billion loan out and not make any money off of that for 25 years, that's a problem. And that's one of the
Yeah.
problems that's really got in the way of building nuclear. If you now with SMRs take $1 billion loan out and you're getting it out in 4 or 5 years, that same $1 billion is going to be able to get you your money back a lot faster. Ontario has, of all the provinces, the greatest, I can't remember quite what it's called, but the debt to power ratio. So there's the money that was borrowed to build the nuclear power plants and the hydro plants. And because the money was borrowed, there's this debt that Ontario carries. But the
Mhm.
reason it carries so much debt is because the nuclear power plants last for so long. So the amortization of the loan is commensurate with how long you've got the money out and how long your power plant is going to be built, putting electricity onto the grid. So it can look like it's expensive, and it is expensive, and it carries the expense differently because they last so long. So is nuclear more expensive than wind and solar? This is getting into finances that are outside the scope of my expertise.
Okay. You don't have to answer everything. I don't know is an
Yeah,
acceptable answer. Like that's something I would like actually more generally to be a social norm. It's okay for someone to answer, I don't know.
well, but it's not a. It's I would say it's more of a I don't know enough,
Okay.
which is a slightly different answer. So what I can say is that nuclear still does make sense when the people who sit down and crunch the numbers on this are coming up with ways of trying to make the electricity grid work. When they do the numbers carefully, a lot of jurisdictions, Ontario is one, Saskatchewan is another, Alberta's looking at this as well. There's places down in the US, there's places in other countries as well. Um, they do keep coming up with nuclear is not a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet for climate change, but it is not so much more expensive than anything else that it can't be a significant part of the mix.
Okay.
The
And I,
details, I'll fully say I don't know. I
all right.
don't.
And I'm just curious. These SMR reactors. This is something out of personal interest. I'm hoping listeners are want to know too. One of the advantages of the CANDU reactors is that it uses natural uranium. It doesn't have to be enriched. We talked about that in our first conversation. These SMR reactors that Ontario is building, will they use natural uranium or will it have to be enriched uranium?
It will be enriched uranium.
Okay,
It will be enriched in the same way that the nuclear reactors in the U.S. and
right.
France and the UK are enriched. It's
Okay,
enriched at the same level. Um, so yeah, that's
all
and
right.
to be clear, just to be clear, Canada does not have any enrichment facilities. Full stop. Period. We do not
Right.
have.
That,
So
yeah, that was one of the big things about the CANDU reactors, and I was hoping that the CANDU technology or would be able to make it into the SMR design, but that's not what happened here.
actually, it is oddly
Oh,
can
but
do
but, it, but
can
the CANDU reactors use natural uranium.
but that's not the one that they chose to build.
Ah, okay. We
So
just so sorry so Ontario's choosing to build not a CANDU reactor but a different one.
right. So the can do three.
SMR.
Yeah, the CANDU 3 was 300 megawatts and was a nuclear reactor that was designed in Canada and never built. And when Ontario Power Generation sat down and looked at the different options, they had they had a number of different technologies to choose among, and the one that they chose from was the BWRX 300.
Okay.
Now, I don't understand all of the reasons why they did that. I have some ideas, but they could have chosen to go with the Can-Do 3, but nobody had actually looked at that reactor design in a good 15 years or so. But it does exist. Like nobody threw that out.
Right. And someday someone might build it, but that hasn't happened yet. And nothing has been announced about it actually coming into becoming a reality beyond the blueprint phase.
So Atkins Realis, which used to be SNC Lavalin,
Mm-hmm.
which now has the intellectual property of how to build a CANDU reactor, has announced a new reactor design called the Monarch. And that Monarch is not an SMR. It's a full-sized large reactor. And they are actually intending to sell this large reactor because when you have economies like China, it doesn't make sense to actually do this piecemeal 300 megawatts at a time. They need more electricity than I can imagine. So they want to build as much as fast as they can. So we may see more CANDU type reactors. We may see more natural uranium type reactors. There's also molten salt reactors, which are being developed here in Canada and elsewhere that can potentially take the waste of other reactors and burn it and make more electricity. There's a lot of exciting technologies that's happening in nuclear.
Okay. Well, all right. I've got two more questions for you, each of which has some depth to them. One is, I hear that nuclear energy is sustainable, by which is meant like it can go on forever. Like if you compare it with, you know, coal or gas or even oil, there's a certain amount in the earth, and like whatever amount there is over the span of a human lifetime or of human civilization, there's no more being made. And I've read that we've already hit peak oil. Maybe if we drill aggressively, we can increase that, but there's a finite amount, and at some point it's going to be depleted. How much uranium is there in the earth? I mean, there's a finite amount of uranium too, but the energy density is so high. I'm wondering, how long is it before uranium, like we mine all of the uranium in the earth, or we mine all of the readily accessible uranium that we can get to in a feasible way? Is there a lot, or will we run out at some point, especially if we transition to more and more nuclear energy across the globe?
Centuries.
Centuries. Okay. There's lots of it, and it's easy to get to.
I mean, I can give you a longer answer, but I
No,
thought
no, you know what? No, that's fine. I think that's good. That's pretty much what I wanted to know. I'll take your word for it. All right. So let me. I've got one more. I've got one more.
Yeah.
One more question for you, and that is, to my mind, and by we I mean humanity, our species across the globe.
The big we.
We need to figure out how to replace and not always take more. So what I mean is, more nuclear seems to make the most sense to me. Like we need to. Sorry, when I say we need to do with less, I mean we need to flatten the energy growth curve. Like we can't keep having more and more and more and more and more and more and more energy demand, electricity demand. We've got to figure out how we can meet our needs and we talked about this to some extent in our first conversation. We need to meet our needs with less demand on energy and less demand on electricity. And one of the strong arguments in favor of nuclear energy is if we can replace other sources of energy, particularly coal and gas for the carbon footprint. But that's not what we tend to do. If we build more energy, we just use more energy. And if we go back 10 to 5 years ago, the blockchain, the Bitcoin, if all the energy if you measure all of the energy that went into Bitcoin mining, and you consider that and you rank that against country usage, it would be, I think it was the 7th largest country in the world by energy usage just for Bitcoin. If you look at the last few years, last 3 or 4 years, it's AI. I mean, I think it was I think it was Schmidt who just a few months ago went in front of Congress and said that he wanted to use like 90% of the electricity generated in the U.S. to go for AI. Like we always come up with more uses for energy rather than build. Like, so if we build a new plant, we don't retire a gas plant, we don't retire a coal plant. We just have more energy at our more electricity at our disposal. Is there a way that we can break our energy addiction, that if we build a plant, we can actually replace existing infrastructure, or replace the higher carbon emission technologies? Or are we kind of doomed to just always use more if there's more available? It's there's a name for this, like Jevons paradox, right? If you build more lanes on a highway, traffic gets worse after a few months after the construction is finished. And I think of that in terms of energy as well. Like if we build more energy, more electricity, we just find more uses for it rather than replacing more polluting sources. I was hoping you could comment on that. It's a fairly long introduction to the question.
Um, I'm familiar with Jevons paradox. I was in a class a number of years ago, and I made the comment, I hate coal. And my TA in front of the class, in front of me, said, I love coal. And I went, okay, you have the floor. And he said, coal gave us the Industrial Revolution. Oil gave us the modern world. To hate them is to misunderstand history. And there was a T-shirt and a button that was going around Calgary a little while ago. I heart oil. And what I came up with was, I heart oil, but I think it's time we start seeing other people.
Okay.
What I've noticed is that Jevons paradox, in terms of capacity, seems to have an awful lot to do with how cheap it is. And I want to be clear, fossil fuels gave us very cheap energy. Bitcoin works because energy is, and electricity specifically, is cheap. AI is free because electricity is cheap. If we take climate change seriously, whether we go, however much we go with nuclear, because we will go with nuclear. There's no way to fight climate change without nuclear, any more than there's any way to fight climate change without solar, to fight climate change without wind, to fight climate change without hydro. We'll have to figure out carbon capture and storage, which is another whole talk. And I'm not that guy. I can find that person for you. Not that guy.
Fair. Yep. We need to push forward aggressively on all these fronts.
On all these fronts, because the problem is bigger than we think it is. Even when we think climate change is a big problem, it's bigger than we think it is. It's more difficult than we think it is. The cheap availability of transportation and electricity has allowed a fundamental transformation of society. And Jevons paradox is not based on availability just from a capacity standpoint, but an availability from the standpoint of it is inexpensive. So I think what's going to happen is that market forces are going to wind up making electricity more expensive. Housing prices will continue to go up. So we will wind up seeing urban densification happening more and more because housing prices will continue to go up. Energy prices will actually go up. And that's not because nuclear is wrong or solar is wrong, but because we had all these externalities, and we're going to pay trillions of dollars of externalities for climate change. So I think Jevons paradox is relevant in that energy has long been cheap. Electricity has long been cheap. And I think it's going to get more expensive. So I don't think we're going to see the huge explosion of blockchain or I don't know what's going to happen with that stuff.
Right.
That's out of scope. But
right, but I wonder if that's true, because we had a tax on carbon, which was an attempt to price into electricity generation and energy usage in general, price into the cost some of those externalities. The price of gas at the pump, for example, is always a hot button issue for politicians and in the media. And we just our Prime Minister Mark Carney, while campaigning, he was Prime Minister, but campaigning to be reelected, killed the carbon tax in Canada. He said it's done. And I'm just wondering, do you think that I realize this is taking you outside of your expertise as a scientist and as a physicist, but is there the political will to allow market forces to increase the price of electricity? It's the sort of thing that tends to get subsidized, and it'll affect everybody. And is there the political will to allow market forces to let that happen, in your opinion?
Not yet. Climate change is still abstract. Climate change is still something that academics sit around and worry about, and kids have panic attacks about. Climate change is still something that seems like, oh, yeah, well, I guess if you believe that that's going to be a problem. And when I talk to people, when I talk to kids, they're like, oh, yeah, climate change, it's real, it's bad, it's going to affect me for the rest of my life. Kids get it. Adults don't. Adults don't understand how much trouble we're actually in. And when we start seeing food shortages, which I believe in the first episode I predicted in the 2030s, 2030, I actually think I think in 2030, and if I'm wrong in 5 years, come back and yell at me.
I hope you are. I don't think you are, but I hope so.
I hope I am too. But the prediction that I've made, and I was actually on a oddly, I never do podcasts, but this is 3 podcasts in 3 weeks. But I made a prediction on a podcast where I was being interviewed about climate change specifically yesterday, and I said, look, in 2030, you're gonna have something, and the 2 that I like predicting are coffee and chocolate, because that seems to capture people's imaginations. But the first time you walk into Starbucks, and the entire Greater Toronto area just doesn't have coffee available. Like, you can walk into a Starbucks and they're like, have this instead of coffee in 2030. And I'm not saying that coffee will never happen again, but I think that when we hit a point where we just walk in and go, what do you mean there's no coffee? And it's not a supply chain issue, and it's not, the shipment got held up in the US or something. We're just going to
there's an actual shortage, global shortage of coffee, that people can't drink it anymore.
Yeah, because
not everyone can.
Where coffee is grown, it's a fragile crop, blah, blah, blah. And when you see coffee just suddenly disappear, people are going to suddenly go, well, why did nobody tell us this was coming? And I was hoping that the smoke that we have to deal with would do that for people. I was hoping that people recognizing that 10 years ago, you could send your kids outside to play to get fresh air. I was hoping that was actually going to shake things up enough. And people aren't talking about the smoke as a climate change problem. And I'm pretty sure that when we have those first instances of food shortages, people are going to try and say it's not climate change, but it will be climate change. The smoke that we're dealing with is climate change. The infestation of pine beetles that we're dealing with is climate change. The massive die-off of trees is climate change. Climate change is here. It's happening. It's not personal yet. And there will not be enough political will to fight climate change in the way that it needs to be fought until the consequences of climate change are personal, until the consequences of climate change are something that people cannot deny. When people are angry about how climate is changing, when people are realizing that the world is getting worse for human habitation as a result of our fossil fuel use, there will be very, very angry people. And until then, we're going to wind up having people like Donald Trump get elected, who are elected on the resentment about people trying to plan for the future that they can't understand is coming. So, no, there's not the political will yet. And there won't be until we are already in the boiling water. And it's not that it will be too late then. We can still do things at that point. The faster we take action on climate change, the less action we need to take, the less pain we're going to need to be in, and the less it's going to cost.
The best time to start addressing climate change was 30 years ago. The second best time is today.
Exactly. But we're not. We're not really changing our behavior yet. Winston Churchill said Americans can be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other options. And I don't think that's a uniquely American thing. I think that's just how people are. We want the convenience. We want the cheap. But when it comes down to it, when it gets real for people, and we're getting to that point, we're getting to the point where food shortages are coming in 2030. And if I'm wrong, come back and yell at me. But I think in 2030, the food shortages start. And it's not just coffee and chocolate. It's, you have 10 million people who just don't have enough rice and are starving as a result of it. But it's the coffee and chocolate that captures people's imagination, not millions of people starving because they don't have enough calories. That's what we're facing. And that is what's going to motivate the political will. We have to treat this as seriously as we treated World War II, because the consequences of climate change, if we act now, will be as bad as World War II. The longer we wait, the worse it'll be.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I hope that that message, we can, through this podcast and through everything else that we do, we can make that understanding more widespread. Jason, thank you for sitting down with me a second time. This has been a wonderful conversation. Any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think I closed the first session by saying something to the effect of, kids today are awesome. And I at the risk of repeating myself, I want to say that again. When I look at the youth today, they get it. When I look at the youth today, they understand that we have to actually sit down and, as the Center for Inquiry, like, be curious, inquire, set aside our preconceptions, set aside the way the world has always been. And when I talk to youth today, they're willing to do that because they see the threats that are necessary. And fortunately, it's those people who are going to be faced with the difficult decisions that have to be made in the coming decades as our world changes. So I think that humanity is still up for the challenge of facing what is an existential threat. So I still have hope, because when I look at what we have coming through, the people who are growing up right now, I still believe that we have a strong reason to be hopeful about what's coming, because people are interested, curious, and they're inquiring.
Wonderful. Jason Donev, thank you again for a wonderful conversation on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.